Chapter 14. When we came out of tunnel in the Confederation's central system, I knew what had to be taken care of and in what order. The massive domed city in space orbiting the great gas giant still looked beautiful to me, like a place of wonder. But now I was also afraid of what I would find there. We all stared out the view screen, and Alice and Colonel Rage were speechless as they gaped at the technological marvel. I wanted to join them, but I was too busy trying to figure out how to keep us alive and safe. The first priority was communication, and I sent out the messages that needed to be transmitted. Then I contacted docking control, identified who we were, and asked for docking procedures. There was a long silence, and then we were given an approach route. I tried contacting some old friends on the station, and found that much as I had expected, our communications had been cut off. Once they had discovered who we were, someone hadn't wanted us telling our side of the story. The docking bay was in a secure portion of the spaceport, and we stepped out into an area of unadorned white walls. The air smelled sterile with a vague hint of disinfectant. I thought about how this must seem to Alice, who was getting her first view of the inside of the station. This didn't feel like visiting an amazing futuristic society. It felt like a field trip to space prison. A dozen peace officers were on site to meet us. They represented a variety of species. Several looked vaguely humanoid, but with different shaped heads, or non-Earth skin colors and various cranial protrusions. There were also a few species that looked a bit like Earth animals, including the bull-headed and beaked-ottered aliens I'd seen before. They came in various shapes and colors and heights, but they all had one thing in common. They all glared at us like they hated our guts. I noticed that several of them wore black armbands with the squiggly fire symbol for the movement of peace. We were getting off to a terrific start. "You are being detained for questioning," said a very tall humanoid. He had a triangular head and an almost impossibly thin body, around which he wore a close-fitting uniform. His hands looked about as thick as construction paper. "Do not give us any trouble." They escorted us down a long, bleak corridor to a sparsely furnished room, large and white, with a narrow table in the center, around which were a few chairs. "Wait here," the narrow peace officer said. For how long?" I asked. "For as long as it takes." The door closed behind us, and I heard the hiss of a vacuum seal. It felt like we were being sterilized. "I put Zeke in charge when the shuttle was in crisis," said the colonel after a moment. "I believed him to be the best qualified person for that job. The way I see it, I am best qualified to handle our dealings with the aliens. Let me speak when the time comes. I'm in command, and I'll get us out of this." We all agreed, and with that settled, we sat and waited for another 3 hours. There's nothing like the combination of fear and boredom to make the time crawl. Then, at last, the door opened, and 3 beings stood there. 2 peace officers, flanking an all-too-familiar bulky form. Junip looked like I remembered, with his goatee face, his hairy body, and his seemingly incongruous shell hanging on his back. He strode in quickly so his cape billowed out behind him. He wore no shirt, but around one of his shaggy arms he had a black band showing the flaming symbol. "You clearly know how to make an impression, Mr. Reynolds," he said. "Last time you arrived, it was after destroying an enemy ship. This time you decided to take out one of your own." "I sent the logs and my report," I told him. "You know what happened." "My nephew was on that ship," Junip said, his voice hard. "Your nephew was a mutineer," I said. "He tried to kill me." Colonel Rage cleared his throat, reminding me that he was supposed to be speaking for the group. "Excuse me," he said. "My name is Colonel Richard Rage, United States Army, and—" "I know who you are," Junip said. "3 of the juvenile humans I recognize. The 4th is the stowaway, another criminal from a world of beings who delight in breaking their own laws, and when those are exhausted, anyone else's laws they can find." "You're Junip, right?" the colonel asked, not letting himself sound even slightly put out. "Interim Director Junip." "Well, Interim Director Junip, allow me to express my condolences on the passing of your nephew. We are also saddened by the loss of life aboard the Kind Disposition, as well as the destruction of the ship itself. That said, I can assure you that Zeke was not seeking to harm people or property, but rather to avoid being destroyed by a missile fired at us with murderous intent. It was your nephew who told us his orders were—
I'm afraid that the picture is far from clear,
Junip interrupted, swishing his cape theatrically. He must have learned that move in villain school.
It appears to me you became some sort of threat to the kind disposition, and Captain Hyai took appropriate action against you. Unfortunately, you would not accept his authority, mutinied, and destroyed a Confederation vessel. And now you want praise, I suppose?
Colonel Rage was on his feet. You don't really intend to sell that malarkey, do you? There was an organized revolt on that ship. Every officer on board was part of it, except for the captain and that Urch fellow.
And so you executed them?
You know what happened.
This matter will be subject to scrutiny, said Interim Director Junip, as well as any agreements my predecessor made with you.
Colonel Rage pinched the bridge of his nose with his thumb and index finger. Look, these kids aren't warriors, and they sure aren't criminals. They're survivors. It's pretty easy to see that you're not fond of them, and I'm willing to bet you weren't so keen on this crazy mission Glee-Wixix had in mind for them.
You are right in that, Junip said. I once had a great deal of respect for her, but this was a fool's errand.
Then give us a ride home. I'm sure you've got your own fires to put out. You don't want us here, and we don't want to be here. Send us back to Earth, and no one has to know about any of this. You can say the ship was destroyed in an accident, say your enemies did it, and use it to gain more support for whatever it is you want. Just don't let these kids get caught up in your power struggle. Junip stroked his goatee beard thoughtfully.
If we can keep this story from spreading, then such a thing might be possible.
The colonel nodded. I thought we might be able to do business. Uh-oh, Smelly observed. I sighed. Smelly was correct. I had already made this option unworkable. Unfortunately, it's a little late for that, I told them.
You can't have pulled the same stunt by bringing in your data collector friends. We blocked your communications as soon as you made contact.
I kind of figured you'd want to control the story, I said. So I sent out the information before I contacted docking control.
That is against the rules, Junip cried. You cannot make private communications before contacting docking control.
I know, I said, which is why I figured it wouldn't occur to you. Junip snorted. He took a couple of quick strides around the room before turning sharply to face me.
Then I'm afraid I can't help you. You wanted your fabricated story to be public, and now it is. Now I must consider my options. Tell me, have you ever heard of Planet Pleasant?
No, I said, but with a name working that hard, it can't be any place I'd like to visit.
It is where the fads conduct their cruelest and most unspeakable scientific experiments. I'm sure they would be most grateful to me if I had you delivered there. The fads don't believe that adolescents are completely developed sentient beings, you know. It's one of the reasons your actions have so infuriated them. I'm sure they would love to cut your head open and find out what makes you so irritating.
Hold on, Colonel Rage began, but Junip was clearly done talking. He turned towards the door. What happens now? Misan asked.
For now, you are being held as prisoners,
Junip said.
I no longer have the option of dealing with this quietly, so I'm going to need a few hours to determine how best to manage this latest disaster.
He shook his head.
Zeke, you can see that this is your fault. Can you imagine how much easier things would be if you weren't always trying to outsmart everyone?
They'd be easier, Colonel Rage said, because he'd be dead.
Yes,
Junip agreed as he stepped out the door.
That would make things easier, wouldn't it?
We sat around the table, feeling despondent. We've pretty much got no options here, Colonel Rage said. They don't fear Earth as a military power, and diplomatic relations with our world don't matter to them. We could disappear,
and there's nothing the people back home could do about it.
I don't think you're making me feel better, Charles said.
Sorry, son, just thinking out loud. I'm trying to determine our next move. But I'm not coming up with a whole lot.
I felt everyone staring at me, like the situation was my fault. I wasn't so sure I wanted to take the blame, though. Maybe he would have sent us home if I hadn't have gone public, I said. But maybe he would have just... Or maybe we would have just been easier to make quietly vanish. That Planet Pleasant idea seemed to come to him pretty quickly. The main thing now is that since our being here is public knowledge, Junip can't treat us too badly.
Colonel Rage said. That's a fair point. It could be that your little stunt saved our behinds, Zeke.
How do you mean? I asked.
He's keeping us locked in this room because he's not got nowhere else to put us. That means they made no plans for our leaving this facility. He either had a ship gassed up and ready to go, or we were never getting off this space station alive.
Junip's a weenie, but he wouldn't... I trailed off, because it seemed pretty much like he would. In fact, he'd already tried. I needed to remember that I couldn't put anything past him. The colonel was in full agreement.
Whoever organized the takeover of the kind disposition had to be someone pretty high up the chain of command. It makes things easier if you have a bunch of blind followers wearing armbands who are willing to do pretty much anything you say.
After another few hours, the narrow, triangle-headed peace officer opened the door and told us that Junip was ready for us.
Ready for what? The colonel demanded.
You don't ask questions here, the peace officer said.
Son, these young people are my responsibility, so you either tell me what I want to know, or we're going to have a problem. Given it looks like I could tear you in half, I think you'd rather do things the easier way.
The peace officer blinked its large triangular eyes several times. There will be a brief presentation to data collectors. After that, you're being taken to your quarters in the government compound where these youths stayed the last time they were in the station. We followed the peace officer into the hallway, and a second officer fell in line behind us. We then walked until we met up with Junip near where the hallways ended with a pair of double doors. Junip looked over us, and then his eyes rested on me.
I would ask you not to do anything foolish, but that's like asking rotten fruit not to stink. If you don't wish to be offended by rotten fruit, you must dispose of it in the proper environmentally sensitive recycler unit.
This analogy is confusing me, I said. Am I the recycler unit?
Because you chose to circulate misleading rumors about what happened on that ship, I must now address the data collectors who have gathered outside. I emphasize that it is I who will address them, not you. I wish you to be present to lend tactic support to what I have to say.
Junip keyed something into his data bracelet, and I felt my own bracelet hum as it received a transmission. I saw all the others react as well, so I knew that whatever he'd sent me, he'd sent to all of us.
To guarantee your cooperation, I've just used my security override to send a dampening field to each of your data bracelets. If you choose to speak, only my officers and your fellow criminals will hear you, so there's no point in attempting to communicate with anyone else. I don't like this, Colonel Rage said. You don't have to. I'm trying to manage this situation to the best of my ability. You may not enjoy what I have to say, but you will endure it, in part because it is the best way to ensure a favorable final outcome for you, but also, more importantly, because there's nothing you can do about it.